Continue our look at the different gospel accounts of Easter and Jesus' resurrection. Last week, we considered Matthew. This week, we're in Mark, the shortest of the four gospels. So before we dive in, I invite you to hear Mark's telling of the Easter story, beginning with chapter 16, verse 1, and continuing through verse 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices, so they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side. And they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I don't know about you, but Mark is the gospel I spend the least amount of time in. Matthew, Luke, and John tend to steal the spotlight. They're more polished and more filled out in terms of stories and teachings and details. For example, in both Matthew and Luke, when we go with Jesus into the desert following his baptism, we read how Satan tempted him to turn stones into bread when he was hungry, to worship Satan in exchange for authority over all the kingdoms of the world, to throw himself from the top of the temple and let the angels catch him, to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt to everyone who he really was. It's a truly riveting contest. All Mark says about this episode in Jesus' life is that the Spirit cast Jesus into the wilderness. He was there for 40 days. He was tempted by Satan in the company of wild animals, and angels waited on him. That's it. No particulars, no description, no nothing really, except a statement that it happened. And so, because much of what Mark relates is also captured in Matthew and Luke, but expanded with richer texture and deeper insight, we tend to gravitate toward those accounts. But the truth is, we wouldn't have Matthew or Luke without Mark. Mark was almost certainly the first gospel to be written, and thus set the basic template for how Jesus' story would be told. Scholars disagree about the precise nature of the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we can probably never know for sure. But both Matthew and Luke follow the contours of Mark's general outline. Both may very well have written their Gospels, at least in part, in response to Mark's Gospel, out of dissatisfaction with what Mark fails to say and how he goes about saying what he does say. The style and language of Mark are both a bit rough around the edges in ways that were perhaps off-putting to more educated, literary-minded folks. But that roughness, that lack of refinement, to me, also gives Mark a certain appeal, in the same way that a bootleg concert tape has an appeal different from a polished studio album. I like to think of Mark as the Harlan Howard gospel, 3 chords and the truth. Mark is like Johnny Cash on stage with nothing but his acoustic guitar and his gravelly baritone. It's raw and stripped down, yet it has a way of grabbing you and pulling you in. And once you're on board, Mark takes off and doesn't look back. This earliest and shortest of the Gospels is right there in your face from the beginning, and so is Mark's Jesus. Listen to how much ground Mark covers right out of the gate. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, "See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." John the Baptizer appeared in the wilderness, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And people from the whole Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem were going out to him and were baptized by him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. Now John was clothed with camel's hair, with a leather belt around his waist, and he ate locusts and wild honey. He proclaimed, "The one who is more powerful than I is coming after me. I am not worthy to stoop down and untie the thong of his sandals. I have baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove upon him. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." That's just the first 10 verses. There's no genealogy, no birth narrative, no backstory at all, except the brief mention of the connection between the prophet Isaiah and John the Baptist. The prophetic voice crying in the wilderness gives way straight to a Messiah baptized in the wilderness. And when Jesus emerges from his trial with Satan, he calls his disciples, and the demons and the afflictions start to fly. One of the defining features of Mark's narrative is his repeated use of the word immediately. Jesus does things immediately, and things happen for Jesus immediately. The disciples leave their nets and immediately follow Jesus. Jesus touches a leper, and immediately the leprosy leaves his body. The scribes are grumbling, and immediately Jesus knows in his spirit what they're thinking in their hearts. There's no dilly-dally here, either in Mark's writing or in the story he's unfolding. What I find captivating is that all of these characteristics of language and style serve to convey and reinforce the image of Christ Mark is presenting. Unlike Matthew's rabbi Jesus, Mark's Jesus is a Messiah of action rather than a heaven-sent sage offering master classes on the side of mountains. He's a healer and a caster out of demons more than a teacher, a prophet straight from the mold of his camel-wearing, locust-eating predecessor, who confronts people and demons alike head-on. Mark's Jesus is a teller of parables, too, but in many cases those parables seem intended to leave the hearers guessing rather than enlightened. In fact, one of the most curious aspects of Mark's gospel is what is often termed the messianic secret. As Jesus tells his parables and heals the suffering and the possessed all around Galilee, he speaks in veiled language and frequently tells those whom he heals not to tell anyone what he has done. At times, he tells the disciples not to say anything about him until he is raised from the dead. True to human nature, though, the people healed, some after years or even a lifetime of affliction, can't help themselves. They tell anybody and everybody, and Jesus' fame spreads like wildfire. By contrast, some of the most direct and straightforward conversations Mark's Jesus has are with the unclean spirits he casts out. And interestingly, the unclean spirits are the ones who see and understand most clearly who Jesus is, certainly more so than any of the religious experts, even more so than the disciples whom Jesus has called to follow him. There's a cosmic dimension to Mark's telling of the gospel, akin to but different from John's. All of which brings us to Mark's rendition of the Easter story. True to form, it's short, stripped down, and to the point. It's all of 8 verses long. The women venture to Jesus' tomb early on Sunday morning. They discover the stone rolled away, and they meet an angel who tells them to go and tell the disciples that Jesus is risen and will meet them in Galilee just as he promised. The detail that really distinguishes Mark's account from the others is that upon seeing and hearing the angel, the women flee the tomb in fear and don't say anything to anyone because they are afraid. Now, if you're following along, you'll be thinking, the 16th chapter of Mark's Gospel in my Bible goes to verse 20, and you're correct. Hopefully, though, between verse 8 and verse 9, there is a heading that says the shorter ending of Mark, followed by a statement in brackets saying basically that in the end, the women changed their minds and did, in fact, tell the disciples. Verses 9 through 20, then, should be labeled the longer ending of Mark. If they're not, I'd encourage you to get another Bible, because the editors and translators of the edition that you have aren't being upfront and honest with you. Bible scholars are in almost universal agreement that the original text of Mark's Gospel ends at verse 8. These alternate endings were added later by scribes and commentators who, perhaps like Matthew and Luke, weren't quite satisfied with Mark's ending, both in what he said and what he left unsaid, or who wanted to harmonize Mark with the other 3 Gospels. If you look at verses 9 through 20, you'll see elements of Matthew, Luke, and John's Easter accounts all mashed up together, along with some crazy stuff about snakes. What scholars disagree about is whether Mark intended to end his gospel at verse 8, or if there was something more that somehow got lost early on, perhaps when the circulating copy of the gospel became damaged. If you're interested in some quarantine reading, there are dozens of books and articles arguing each side, and I'd be happy to make some recommendations for you. We'll probably never know for sure. What we can know and what we should recognize is the uneasiness of where verse 8 leaves us. And what we really need to do is to sit with it and embrace the rawness of it, and avoid the temptation to go back and overdub it or remix it. To me, this is the value in having Mark's Easter account alongside the other 3. Because Mark, more than any of the other Gospels, renders Easter a mystery. He confronts us with the sheer awe of the resurrection and reminds us that there is something here beyond us, beyond our comprehension, that should overwhelm us, even frighten us a bit, and remain beyond our grasp if we see the empty tomb plainly, stripped down for what it is. In Jesus, God has become flesh. In Jesus, God has been crucified. In Jesus, God has risen again from the dead. If that is anything less than mind-blowing and stupefying, we haven't yet seen what Mark and the other gospel writers are trying to show us. One of the things I find most appealing about reading verse 8 as the ending Mark intended is that it leaves us wanting more while also leaving us with a reversal of what has been. We've had a whole narrative filled with people who were healed and released and told not to tell, but went away and told anyway. Now, at the end, we have a group of the faithful who are told to tell, but don't say anything to anyone. It's a jarring reminder, a blunt presentation of how any and all of us so often don't do what Jesus, the prophets, and the other messengers of God instruct us to do, and do the very things we are instructed not to do, whether those instructions come in the form of a murky parable or a clear and direct command. And there truly is good news in an ending like verse 8. because it means this story doesn't rest on us or turn on us. And it isn't over, not yet. As Mark says in the first verse of his first chapter, this is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. Mark's unplugged, perhaps unfinished, and most certainly unfiltered telling of the gospel centers on what Jesus does, what Jesus accomplishes in the face of human and devilish opposition, and how he succeeds despite human foibles and failures. Mark declares boldly that demons and unclean spirits can't stand against Jesus, and neither can our human fickleness and fecklessness. The fear and failure of these women to heed the angel's instructions had no negative impact whatsoever on the resurrection and did not stop the news from getting out. Which means there's hope for them and for us. Fears, foibles, failings, regrets, resistance, relapses, and all. As Johnny Cash once sang, further on up the road, where the way is dark and the night is cold, one sunny morning we'll rise, I know, and I'll meet you further on up the road. Jesus has promised to meet us there too. Wherever Galilee is for us, no matter what we do or don't do, no matter how crazy the weather gets or how long the pandemic endures, the Jesus of Mark's raw, mysterious, awe-inspiring, jaw-dropping, head-scratching Easter will not and cannot be stopped. And for that, we truly can say, thanks be to God. Amen.